let's go ahead and get started. And so on behalf of ISPI SoCal, just want to thank all of you for being here today. Really appreciate you taking the time and being in this space together that we can learn and grow within diversity, equity, inclusion. And so before we get started, just a couple logistical things. The bathrooms are wherever you are closest to you in your house. I just want to invite you from the time we kicked this off, for those of you that were there, we said that this is going to be a learning lab and a safe space to be open with one another and to be able to ask questions. And so as our speaker goes through the content, and she has some great activities for us, if there are questions that you have that you've been too afraid to ask about diversity, equity, inclusion, I want you to know that this is a safe space to ask those. We'll suspend judgment for this next 57 minutes that we're together, and at 1 p.m. that judgment comes back. No, I'm just kidding. We will keep that safe space together. So if you have any questions that you've been too afraid to ask, take the opportunity to ask them during this time together. And so that being said, let's get things started with our amazing speaker. And I will introduce Stacey Gordon, who's the CEO and Chief Diversity Strategist of Rework Work. Stacey coaches executive leaders on DEI strategies, and she helps organizations inclusively recruit, hire, and engage employees effectively to creating that inclusion and belonging for all. She is one of the most viewed LinkedIn learning courses. I believe it's over 1 million now. And her unconscious bias course has been translated into several languages and has been featured for LinkedIn, Microsoft, and Virgin America or Alaskan Airlines. And her new book, Unbias, is in the top 5. It was #1 for a little bit on new releases on Amazon. So, Stacey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, thank you. And I appreciate you purchasing the book. Yes, thank you for supporting. So I'm like, purchase the book, review the book, but we'll talk about that later. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen because I am gonna share a few slides. And actually, I was having weird issues today. So today was one of those days where it's almost like, have you done this before, Stacey? I swear I have. But I was really having one of those days like, what is going on? But here we are. So we are talking about how we're going to crush unconscious bias in the workplace. And so as Joey says, I am an executive advisor and diversity strategist. I work with a lot of CEOs, executive leaders, people managers. I train talent acquisition teams, HR teams, individual contributors, basically everybody, because it is the goal for us all to work together to take action. And so what that looks like is through my company, which is Rework Work, our vision is to make all the difference in the world. And it is a huge, lofty goal. And our mission is to make a difference for all. So that means everyone, not just the people that we like. It means, really everyone. But the only way that we can do that is by moving individuals like yourself from awareness to advocacy. Some of you are already along the spectrum. And by spectrum, what I mean is, actually, I'm going to talk about that in a second. I'll tell you about the spectrum. But I wanted to give you a overview, right? Well, what are we talking about today? Why diversity? I get this question all the time. Why diversity? Why do we always have to talk about race, right? What does this matter? What's the point? Why are we talking about this in the workplace? This isn't a workplace issue. Well, it is a workplace issue because people work in the workplace and it's a people issue. So the goal is to be, how can we be more inclusive and how can we get over some of these hurdles and some of these barriers that we are seeing, that we're being confronted with. I think it's a really big thing that keeps coming up. So let's see here. The spectrum that I mentioned is this framework that I use. It's actually part of the framework of the book. And we talk about moving from awareness to advocacy. What we see is that a lot of people are still in status quo, right? That's before you even get to awareness. That's the place where it's like, everything's fine. We don't want to do anything different. We're just going to sit here and wait and see. And awareness is the place where you're really starting to pay attention to what is happening. You're really starting to take action and think about, well, what does that look like? How do we get this information? Because what we found, especially last year, and you might be in this camp, was that in 2020, right, we had not only a pandemic, but we had a lot of mini pandemics, right? And one of those was the murder of George Floyd. And that caused awareness for many people, right? And people wanted to jump straight to action. They wanted to go straight to action, and they wanted to do something, which you would say, Stacey, isn't that what you want? You want people to do something. Yes, absolutely. However, we need that action to be authentic, which means that in order for you to take action, you have to know who you're doing things for, why you're doing it, what action you're supposed to take, and you can't do that without becoming aware of what exactly is happening, right? So the goal is to go from awareness to alignment, and what that looks like is awareness is really the starting point. That is where we should be. Many people, like I said, are in action. That is not the starting point. You've got to dial it back a little bit and get to understanding, you know, who are we talking to? Are we looking at, are we doing focus groups? Are we looking at engagement surveys? Are we looking at DEI surveys? Are we doing an audit? Do we understand what is happening in our workplace? Do we know what that data looks like? Because when we know that, then our key leaders can start to align on a strategy. Aligning on strategy is so important because then you can take action, right? That's where you get to this place where you're prepared to actually take strategic and authentic action. And then you can get to advocacy, which I haven't found a single company that's there yet, right? Which is taking action and being sustainable, sustaining inclusive workplaces. They're all striving to get there, but we're not there yet. So it's part of the reason we're having today's conversation. And the authentic action that we want, you know, we've got to think about what are the key terms, because it's so interesting when we say diversity, we may or may not be talking about the same thing. I just a couple of days ago was talking to a prospective client, and I asked if the audience that they wanted me to address was diverse. There were two individuals on the call. One of them said yes, one of them said no. So that made me laugh, but I said, okay, well, let's define what I mean when I say diverse. So one of them was thinking diversity of gender, the other was thinking diversity of race and ethnicity. So it's really important that when you start to have these conversations, that you are all on the same page and you can align on what are we even talking about here. And then you can get to start to work towards inclusion, right? But you get to inclusion kind of through equity as well, right? We have to start looking at how do we overcome barriers to achieving equality in the workplace. Everyone wants to talk about equality, but you can't get there without equity. And eventually, the place that we want to get to is belonging. The place where you show up at work and you feel welcomed. You feel like you belong. You don't question, do I belong here? You don't question whether or not your supervisor is going to listen, or whether or not you're valued, or whether or not you're going to be able to provide input, or whether or not you can talk about what you did on the weekend without potentially being judged, because maybe you spent your weekend in church or at the mosque or skiing with your same-sex partner, right? You want to be able to come in and contribute just like everybody else. So it is really important that before we even start the conversations, that we get in alignment on what are we talking about. I like to use this wheel, the diversity wheel. I don't know how many of you have seen it. Have you seen it? Give me a hands up or a wave or an emoticon or something if you've seen this before. A couple of you, okay. Some of you might have seen this represented as a tree, right, with branches on top. That's what you see. That's your visual representation. And then what's below, the roots, right? Those are the things you don't necessarily see. Or you may have seen it represented as an iceberg, where again, you know, what's on above the ocean is, you know, what's visible, and what's not is below. I like to use this wheel because it looks like a bullseye. And to me, it answers the question, that comes up all the time, which is, oh, why does everything always have to be about race? Well, for me, right, as a Black woman, sometimes it is about race because I don't know how else to walk through the world. And on the other side of that, it's understanding that somebody who's not Black, they're going to walk through the world the way that they see the world, right? We all come into being looking at the lens through which we know. We only know our own. We don't know what other people are feeling, thinking, experiencing. And it is extremely hard to be empathetic and to be able to put ourselves in the shoes of somebody else. We can say it, right? But it's not an easy thing to do. So the center circle is that bullseye. It is the thing. Like when I showed up today, the first thing you can see is that I'm Black and I'm female, right? I can't hide those things. They're visible. You don't know, however, if English is my first language, right? You don't know my cultural background. You can't tell those things because they're on the outer circle. So the other reason I like to use this as visual representation of our dimensions of diversity is because if you're part of what is like the dominant society, right, the dominant culture, and that might be, pick on white men because right now it's like, oh, well, white men are the dominant, right, culture. And so you might think, well, I don't have diversity, right? Well, you're wrong because this wheel tells you we all have diversity, right? And however, it's not to say that the dominant culture is always going to be white men, right? That's not the case because I have been in environments where the dominant culture was mostly Black or African American. I've worked with clients who, I actually worked with a client who their organization was mostly Latino and they were struggling with hiring people who were non-Latino because the dominant culture was Latino. And so when people came into the workplace, they were like, I don't know, do I belong here? I don't speak Spanish, right? Do I belong here? I'm not Latino. So it was hard to overcome that experience. So I always like to pause and have you think about this and look at the outer circle and think, what is a dimension of diversity that's in the outer circle that I have been excluded, that has been the cause of exclusion at some point in my life. And I'll use the example of a gentleman I talked to a few months ago. When I did this exercise, he said, in New York in the 60s and 70s, when you were Jewish, you couldn't get a job. And he said, I was excluded from so many jobs because I was Jewish. And it also shows how times change, right? How cultures change, how our experiences and our expectations and our bias changes, right? Because bias is based upon geography and culture. So before I move on, I'll just ask, anyone have thoughts, questions, ahas, comments? Because we're a small enough group that I can take a question if you have one. I don't mind being interrupted. You can always unmute yourself and ask a question along the way if you'd like.
Yeah, Stacey, I have a comment. So I'm kind of working on these things myself because I've kind of realized how I've always seen the world is not how people see me. And I have a lot of intrinsic things that I didn't even know I had. Like I'm an Indian, first generation Indian American. So a lot of my Asian upbringing comes out in things that I wasn't even aware of because I consider myself an American. So I've had to kind of do a lot of self-awareness work to understand why I am the way I am.
Yes. And thank you for sharing that. And that's part of this work as well, right? Is everyone kind of wants to jump in and point fingers about what you're doing and what you're not doing, right? But we don't stop and really look inward and say, well, wait, let me start with me. Let me self-reflect on how is this even hitting for me, right? Before I start talking about how other people are experiencing things. So appreciate you sharing that. So I like to do this exercise because it's interesting. You may have done it before, but I want you to think of 5 people who you trust the most who are not family members. So somebody that you might call for advice, you're about to make a big decision, somebody who you might tell confidential, organizational information. You imagine you're at work and you're sitting in the break room and you hear some information, you go, wow, I didn't know that this was about to happen to the company. Who's the first person that you go tell, right? If you're having a challenge, something's coming up for you, who would you call to help process that? So I'm gonna give you like 30 seconds to think about 5 names. I'm gonna be quiet. All right, that wasn't quite 30 seconds, but you should have at least 3 names. You might have more than 5 names, but those names, those people that you have in your mind right now, those are your in-group. So say hello to your in-group, and you're gonna say, but Stacey, my in-group is way larger than this. I'm sure it is. I'm sure there are some more people in it, but for some of you, it might have been really hard to come up with 5. You might have 2. And the reason that we do this exercise is to make a point, right? And the point is this. If you were to put those 5 names on this piece of paper here, and you were to look at these classifications, which again, these relate to the diversity wheel. So the first 4 columns are the center circle, and the next 4 are the middle circle. And ask yourself, how different are the people, the names that I just came up with? How different are they in gender, age, race, ability? Do they have different socioeconomic status, social class? What does that look like? And ask yourself if you have some gaps to fill in. Because if they're all the same gender as you, right? They're all in the same age range. They're all in the same socioeconomic status. That's something to think about, because I'm not by any stretch of the imagination saying you need to throw out your inner circle, right? Like, they are there for a reason. They've earned their place in the inner sanctum, right? But what it does mean is we have to do 2 things. 1, we have to make our inner circle larger and include more people. And 2, we need to include people who are different than ourselves. Because it's very easy for me to open up my inner circle and include 10 Black women. I can do that like that, right? It's going to be a little bit more difficult for me to open up my inner circle and maybe include somebody who is from Pakistan or somebody who is from, South Africa, right? That's going to be a little bit more difficult because it requires us going outside of our normal networks and actually being deliberate about talking to people who are different than ourselves. The importance of this and how this relates back to what I said in the beginning, right? About why are we talking about this, about the workplace? We're talking about this in the workplace because that inner circle, those are the people who get the benefit of knowledge. They get access to information that other people do not get access to. And how this shows up in the workplace is, I'm going to pick on random John, right? I'm using the word John for a reason, because usually you think typical like white guy, right? Maybe probably a CEO, because you've probably also seen the study that there are more CEOs named John than there are women CEOs at all, right? So you might have John who says, well, I want to go to lunch with my inner circle. What's wrong with that? Absolutely nothing. But the problem is when you always go to lunch with the same inner circle, those are the people who get to sit down next to you and hear what's happening with the company. They get to hear all the new projects that are going to be coming up first. They get to hear your insight, your take on it. They get the benefit of your information, of your insider knowledge, right? When something comes up, we are lazy people by nature. That's just how we are. It is so much easier for John to say to Michael, you know what, you're good at this. I want you to take this project, right? Why does he do that? Not because he's deliberately skipping over Anne and Stacey and Preeti, right? He didn't wake up in the morning and say, today I'm going to discriminate against Preeti. I'm going to put a barrier in front of Anne. That wasn't what happened. But you're sitting at lunch with the same people that you talk to day after day after day, and it's just so much easier to grab that person and give them that responsibility and give them that advancement. So this is why we have to make the inner circle larger, because if we make our inner circle larger, we're giving more people opportunity. We're giving more people access. So that is really important, because what also happens is, and what I mentioned too in the beginning in our inner circle, is we trust people in our inner circle. So I've known Joey for a while, and I don't know Preeti at all, right? But so if Preeti comes to me and says, oh, I can't believe Joey said blah, blah, blah about you, I'm going to say, really? Not Joey. He wouldn't say that, right? Because I know him. Now, if it was in the reverse and Joey comes to me and says, Preeti said something about me, I'm going to go, I knew it. She's so, egotistical. She's this, she's that, right? I'm going to come up with all these things because I don't know her. I'm not going to give her the benefit of the doubt. I don't trust her. And I have no reason to, because we're strangers, right? That's not a bad thing. It just is. It's just the way that we behave as human nature, which means that the only way to overcome that is by getting to know people. And so we have the mistaken and misguided thought that because we're coworkers, we have a relationship. Coworker is not a relationship. Coworker is a label, right? It just happens to say that we happen to work in the same place, right? But we don't have a relationship. We have to get to trust. You can't get to trust without a relationship. You have to build that. It takes time. It requires getting to know people. It requires doing more than saying, hey, Angela, how you doing today? And Angela says, fine. Did I even listen for her answer, right? Did I expect her to say anything other than fine? Probably not. I'm probably already walking away before she's answered the question, right? That's not a conversation. That's not a building of a relationship. So it is really important that we take the time because what the people on the outside, right, are the outside of that inner circle. Again, teams are a perfect example of an inner circle and an outer circle. So again, inner and outer doesn't mean bad or good, but it is literally a state of being, and it is a thing for us to recognize that this is what the dynamic is. So they serve their purpose, right? We have a team of 10 because we just need 10 people to do this job. We don't need 20, we don't need 100, right? But understanding that that team is there for a purpose, and that team is going to do a thing, and that team has to trust one another. Because even in a team of 10, what happens? You're going to get 3 people who get to the inner sanctum, right? Those 3 people really know each other, and they tell each other everything, and they've got each other's backs, but they're not doing it for the whole team. For whatever reason, as humans, we get to this place where we are constantly trying to exclude. So my advice and my request, my demand even, is that we do the opposite, right? We have to be constantly looking for ways to include instead of looking for ways to exclude. We've got to do the opposite. So I'll pause here again and ask thoughts, questions, ahas.
Stacey, this is Vince Bedrovich. You mentioned the opposite. Is it kind of like those of us who watched the Seinfeld series where for a while George, everything in his life, he did the opposite and actually got great results on one issue? In other words, in terms of expanding our networks and doing things a bit different to grow and to become more aware?
I'd like to say yes to that, but I did not see that episode. So, and considering how that show goes, I wouldn't want to inadvertently send people down a wrong path. But it sounds like that might work. But really, it's like it is doing the opposite, right, of what's innate to us. If you think about when you're hiring, when's the last time you had to hire to fill a position, right? And what did you do? You got a stack of resumes from people, and you looked at the resumes, and what do? You take the resumes, and your goal is to get rid of as many people out of the pile as possible, right? You're screening out, you're excluding, you're looking, you go, nope, doesn't work, nope, not a good fit, nope, don't have the skills, nope, 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 right? That's your job. Instead, what I'm saying is we need to do the opposite and go through that list of resumes and say, okay, if I have 100 resumes, how many of these people could possibly do this job by any stretch of the imagination? Because if they can, then I need to do a phone screening, right? So I want to include, I want to make the pool of people who could potentially do this job as large as possible. And we want to go in the opposite direction.
I have a comment. So I'm a civil engineer, and I've been working on some volunteer projects on women in engineering. And I was part of Women in STEM 30 years ago when I went to school. So we've spent billions of dollars on these programs, and still 40% of female civil engineers leave the profession today after 30 years of this work. And, you know, I want to do this work, but everyone is telling me it's not worth it. Nothing's going to change, because until there's like 30% of people in the inner circle who get it, and all the women who've done this work literally burn out. And how do you get enough people to make that critical mass to make change happen?
By doing this, right? Like, this is literally what has to happen. So all of the women are in the outer circle, right? They walk in automatically in the outer circle. So unless somebody in the inner circle says, yes, come on in, and invites them in, this is what they're looking at. They fear they don't belong. They're too different. Then they're right. They are too different to fit in, right? Because they're a woman and not a man. They fear that they won't be taken seriously because they're correct, right? They don't get taken seriously. They get questioned more. They get required to show proof more and to demonstrate their experience over and over and over again, right? They have to do more to get to the same place that men have to. I always remember this, I keep forgetting, I need to go back and find this. It was actually a tweet, right? But in this tweet, a gentleman, he explained in a series of tweets actually, that he and his coworker exchanged not exchanged jobs, they had the exact same job, right? So let's call them account reps. They had the exact same job. One is male, one is female. And the guy was like, oh, I love my job, you know, and he was doing really well. He was excelling. The woman was constantly taking longer to get things done. And they were sitting around one day, and he said, you know, I don't encounter some of the things you're talking about. I just don't understand it. And what they did was they switched email. So she responded to all of his emails for a week, and he responded to all of her emails for a week. At the end of that week, she was like, oh my God, this was the best work week of my life. She's like, people just listened to my recommendations. They just took my word for things that I said. They just did all the stuff. She's like, I got so much done. I have never been so productive. The guy was like, this sucked. I was constantly having to go back and explain again and demonstrate proof and do all of these things. You know, and again, they're doing it in email so people don't know that they've switched, right? He was like, how do you get anything done? So that just is to demonstrate the difference, right? For women, we look at them and say, oh, they're not doing as well. Of course they're not, because they have so much crap to get through, so many more hurdles to deal with every single day. And if you have to do that, if you have to work twice as hard, 3 times as hard to get this done, of course you're going to burn out because you're exhausted. So it is so important that the people on the inner circle reach out. So another example, myself as an example, March 31st was the last day of Women's History Month. And March 30th, my book was released, right? And I was laying in bed March 30th, and I thought, I couldn't sleep. I was just, you know, energized. And I was thinking about all the people who had helped me to get the word out about my book. And I thought, oh my God, all the people who reached out, who went above and beyond, went out of their way to help me were all women. Every single one of them were women. And I thought, where the heck are the men, right? This is what we're talking about, is they're in the inner circle and not even, like, we don't factor in, and I'm using men and women as the example for right now, right? Again, men don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm looking to exclude women. That's not the goal. But they wake up and they're just doing what they normally do every day. So the goal is, with unconscious bias, this is why it's unconscious. So we have to interrupt it. This is why we have to start with awareness, because we have to be aware that this is happening, and we have to go, wow, I cannot walk through the world just doing what I normally do. I actually have to think about the decisions. I actually have to think about, who am I including on this team? Who am I interacting with every day? And am I doing things? Am I being deliberate about making sure I am being inclusive? Because if you're not being deliberate about making sure you're inclusive, you are automatically acting exclusively, because that's how we are programmed to work. So I'm going to use this example too. Some of you may have seen Charles Scharf, June 20th. He got into a lot of trouble because he, a memo that he had circulated got publicized that basically said that he couldn't find, I don't remember the exact, let me see, I think I have the quote here somewhere. He said, he said there's a very limited pool of Black people to recruit from, Black talent to recruit from, limited pool. And this was in response to why they don't have enough, African Americans in senior leadership and blah, blah, blah. So basically, this is an example of a man who is the CEO of the company, who believes it's not his problem to fix, right? And believes that the problem is Black people. They're not smart enough. They're not good enough. There aren't enough intelligent Black people for us to hire, right? It's their problem, not my problem. Now, on the other hand, you have Salesforce CEO, who, when confronted with the idea that they might have a pay disparity, was like, I don't believe you, because it's my company and I would never do that purposefully. However, right, he went back, awareness, and said, okay, let me think about this, demonstrate this for me, make me aware, right? They did the pay equity audit. They showed him that, hey, women are being paid less than men, and he fixed it. He didn't say, well, it's the women's fault. They leave and they have babies and they don't have enough experience and whatever, right? He didn't say it was the women's fault. He said, I will fix it. And he fixed it. So this is a perfect example of, you either can fix it or you don't, right? If you have a problem in your company, it is fixable. And it's not a matter of blaming and looking at all the reasons that it can't be done, because you can always find a million reasons why it can't be done. It is, again, doing the opposite, finding the reason it can be done, and especially as the leader of the organization, making sure it gets done. Now, if you're not the leader of the organization, right, this is where individual contributors, people managers have to come into play and say, we want you to do something about it. We have to make a noise about it. We have to actually make it apparent that we want to do something. And this is why you have bad retention, because when people say, you know what, I'm tired of trying to make change and you're not listening, so I'm going to leave. So then you get that issue as well. So inclusion can be learned. I see there's a chat. Let's see, is there questions? Oh, thank you, Vince. So inclusion can be learned. I don't know if any of you have seen this episode of Through the Wormhole with Morgan Freeman, but 2015, I was flipping through channels, happened to like science channels, and came across this episode of Through the Wormhole. What really caught my attention was the title, right? It was, Are We All Bigots? And I'm like, I don't know, Morgan, are we? Maybe we are. So what really got me, though, was the example that was used. They actually cited a study. And I thought, oh my God, why don't more people know about this? So this is the study that they cited. Peggy Mason, who was a professor of neurobiology, she did a study on the biological basis of empathy and helping, and she used rats for this. So what she showed was, and I always have to try to explain this in a way that doesn't confuse, right? So let's say you take rat A and rat B, right? And they are two completely different strains of rats, right? And you put rat A into this little plastic tube here, this container, and rat B can help rat A get out by hitting a little lever. You know how they have those little levers that a rat can hit, right? And it will release the rat in the container. So the rat on the outside, which is rat B, can let him out if he wants to. But he'll go over and sniff and go, we are two different strains. I'm not letting you out. And he'll just carry on his business and leave him in the container. If they are two rats of the same strain, he'll hit the lever and let them out, right? So what Peggy did is she took rats from strain A and strain B, and she socialized them together for a couple of weeks, put them so they would live together, right? And then she tried the exercise again, but she didn't try it with the same rats. She tried it with different rats, right? And this time, even though they were different strains, they let the other rat out. So what does that tell you? It tells you that we can learn to be inclusive. We learn because when they got socialized together, they realized we're not that different. There's actually nothing wrong with you, right? So when she tried the experiment again after socialization, we learned that they have now decided we can hang out together. It's fine. You're cool people. I'm gonna let you out of the container, right? Even though you're a distant relative of the other rats that I hung out with before, I'm still gonna let you out. So it shows us that we can learn to be more inclusive. We can learn to get along with people who are different than us. And it's really not that hard. It actually reminds me of, you've probably heard those stories, right? They're always out there of like the biker guy who is, hardcore racist, Nazi, whatever, right? And gets into an accident on his motorcycle, and a black guy comes along and saves his life, right? And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, black people are cool, right? There's this catalyst, this thing that changes their viewpoint. And so it's like you spent your entire life believing one thing about people, but all of a sudden you got to meet them and actually talk to them, and they helped you, and you realize, everything I learned wasn't actually accurate, right? So it just shows that we can learn these behaviors. So we're going to do an exercise. We're going to do an activity here. And we are going to pair you up. Oops, sorry. Hit the button. We're going to pair you up. And what you're going to do is you're going to answer two questions. If you think back to the diversity wheel for a moment, right? We had outer circles, and I'll actually go back to it in a minute. The goal is I'm going to drop these questions into the chat room so you can see. Actually, I'll put them into the chat as well in a moment. But the goal is really, it sounds complicated, but this is really simple. All you're going to do is think about what dimension of diversity do you identify with the most, right? Other than, right, male, female, ability, age, race, right? We don't want to do the center circle. We don't want to do the really visible ones. We want to do one of the outer ones. So what is one that you identify with? And if you were going to introduce yourself, right, using one of those outer circle dimensions of diversity, what would you say about yourself? How would you introduce yourself? And then you can also talk about, like, are there ones that you maybe hide or downplay at work, right? The other question is, what is an assumption that you wish people wouldn't make about one of the dimensions of diversity that you identify with? So what are some assumptions people make about you just because of, what your political beliefs are, or who you voted for, or what church you go to, or where you live, or what your accent sounds like, right? And what are some ways that maybe you could reframe their thinking about that? So I'm going to put those into the chat in just a moment. I'm going to stop sharing here. And that way we can get those. Let me put it in. Put the first one in the chat. I never remember if you can see the chat when you're in the breakout rooms or not. There's the first question. And there's the second question. Hopefully you'll see these in the breakout rooms. If not, Giuseppe, maybe what you'll be able to do, because you have breakout control, you'll be able to copy and paste it into the little note. So there we go. So we will send you on your way. You'll have an opportunity to discuss this in pairs. Is everybody back? It looks like they are. Okay, great. So I always like to do this. This is really a shortened, exercise, but it's one of the ones that I do in my workshops. And the goal is to get you kind of thinking about your own identity, to get you talking to others. And so there's actually also some active listening exercises that we do as well. But this is just one of the ones to kind of start that conversation, right? To get you on the path and to help you realize, like, wow, yeah, we really could be doing more to learn more about one another and to learn more about ourselves, as Preeti said in the beginning. And so I just think it's important that we think through some of those things and spend some time, getting to know more about the people who are around us. Many times I do these sessions, especially pre-COVID, when we were in person, and I would ask people, how many of you know everyone that's in the meeting? And many of them would say, oh, no, I don't, even though they work on the same floor with the individuals. So I think it is important to just think about the people we pass every day, especially as we start to get back into the workplace, people who we pass and don't talk to. Let's really do that. So I do have a course on LinkedIn, if some of you might have seen it, on conscious bias. It is LinkedIn Learning. So if you're not part of LinkedIn Learning, it's a really great place to get access to lots of courses, especially for your workplace. Unfortunately, you guys just missed, it was free for the last 9 months. LinkedIn actually opened it up and made it free right after the George Floyd murder and all through 2020 and through March of this year. But they're really inexpensive and opportunity for people to be able to, learn more about bias in the workplace. And then, of course, my book, you can take a look. It's at unbiasbook.com, and connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And so I thank you all for being here and for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was
Thank you,
excellent.
Stacey.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great
Thank you.
session.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Stacey.
Thanks, Stacey. For those of you that are still on, want to give you a quick second to plug our next event, which is coming up on May 13th, which we will have an opportunity to process everything that Stacey shared with us. So it'll be an open dialogue for those who want to attend, and I will share that in the link. And for those of you who are not members, please be sure to join ISPI SoCal